Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility, with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
It's correct that regulations matter, but policy matters more. And in fact, I would argue that the right way to view any emerging technology industry is through the lens of policy. I'll give you an example. How did we put a person on the moon? Did we regulate our way to the moon? Did regulators lead the way? Did NASA and the FAA and DOT suddenly allow new and inventive type certified spacecraft? No. Policy matters, leadership matters, and that's the kind of leadership we need today to achieve the goal of ensuring that the United States and its allies lead the world in these new frontiers of UAS and AAM. We need a policy goal to fuel regulatory momentum.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I hope everybody's having a great start to 2022. It's a great pleasure to have Brendan Groves on our show today. We think you advanced mobility entrepreneurs will really enjoy Brendan's talk, generated from his unique background, education, and industry experience. Listen to his perspective on a number of advanced mobility subjects, including policy. Yes, Brendan makes even policy interesting, and address why bold policy and policy goals are important, and his perspective on why the United States needs to lead in this market. Brendan provides unique perspectives on autonomy and why autonomy is king, the importance of the tight integration of software and hardware, of artificial intelligence, and the importance of the drone being able to fly itself, as well as the value of advanced mobility with real-world applications. That's a great section of the podcast. He addresses Luka's questions on the Blue Drone program and the exciting and pioneering value Skydio is providing to its customers and to our industry. As an aside, Brendan's podcast was taped back in November, so a few months ago. If you're a nerd like me, you'll want to take notes on Brendan's podcast. There are so many relevant, important, and challenging comments.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by UAvionics. UAvionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let UAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. UAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Brendan is a recognized expert in aviation, technology, and national security policy. He is the former Associate Deputy Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice, where he led and scaled DOJ's drone program and served on the FAA committee that oversaw the integration of drones into the national airspace system. Brendan is a former United States Air Force officer and private pilot. He received his Bachelor of Science from Pepperdine University and his law degree from Yale Law School. Thanks again, Brendan, for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks so much, Jim.
So I have to ask the first question we ask of all guests. So is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
I think there is, and it's this. People in this industry commonly focus on regulations as the gateway to market growth. Regulations have become, in a sense, the sword in the stone issue. Until we get the right regulations, we'll never achieve the size and scale of the market that we want. It's correct that regulations matter, but policy matters more. And in fact, I would argue that the right way to view any emerging technology industry is through the lens of policy. I'll give you an example. How did we put a person on the moon? Did we regulate our way to the moon? Did regulators lead the way? Did NASA and the FAA and DOT suddenly allow new and inventive type certified spacecraft? No, not at all. Regulation followed policy goals. In 1961, President Kennedy said, we will choose to go to the moon in this decade. That was a policy goal that resulted in policy directives to regulatory agencies like NASA. 8 years later, we got it done. If we had waited for regulators to allow crewed space travel to the moon, we might still be waiting. And I think that's the perfect example that policy matters, leadership matters. And that's the kind of leadership we need today to achieve the goal of ensuring that the United States and its allies lead the world in these new frontiers of UAS and AAM. We need a policy goal to fuel regulatory momentum.
So, Brendan, that's a fresh perspective. How do others feel and how do they differ from you?
People tend to get wrapped around the regulatory axle. And they say, well, if we can just type certify a flying taxi vehicle in 2 years instead of the normal 15 years for traditional legacy aircraft, that's how we'll achieve our goals. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen. Regulators don't all of a sudden cut 12 years off their timeline. That takes policy. And that's what we don't have. We don't have it in the small drone world either. No president, not this one, not the last one, not the one before, has made U.S. leadership in uncrewed and autonomous aviation a presidential and United States priority. That has not happened. And unless and until it does, we will continue to focus, I think, wrongly on regulatory agencies that are not policymakers and that do not move at the speed of policy. And this matters for a simple reason, and it's this. If you look back at the first century of aviation, it began on the windswept hills of Kitty Hawk, continued into the skies of World War II, then up to the stars in the 1960s through the present. The US dominated the first century of flight. And that century was defined by crewed operations with a person at the controls. We're in a new century of aviation now, and this century, unlike the last, is defined by uncrewed and increasingly autonomous operations. And other nations are not content to let the US lead this second century in the same way that we led the first. I am confident that we will prevail, but we need to focus on putting forward bold policies that push regulators to act. Without that, none of these things will come true.
And Brendan, so just to follow up on this a little bit, regulatory gates, as you mentioned, are often quoted as the drivers of the market, much like the Part 107 opened up the commercial space, drone space. And that's because, regulations take time. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. There's a lot of inertia involved. So from the perspective of influencing policy versus changing regulation, how big of a difference is that anyway?
It's a great question. I think there's a big difference. There is one example I can point to as a case in point, and that's in 2017, the then president issued an executive order creating something called the Integration Pilot Program at the FAA. That essentially ordered the FAA to launch a forward-leaning initiative that brought together private companies with public governmental agencies, cities, states, and tribal governments to accelerate advanced drone operations across the country. The IPP, as it was called, was not a panacea, but it forced regulators to move far faster than they otherwise would. And I have no doubt that it potentially shaved years off the cycle to realizing the promises of the UAS and the AAM industries. There is one person who is above all responsible for that, and that's Michael Kratsios, the then U.S. Chief Technology Officer. I was fortunate to work very closely with him in framing parts of that executive order at the time. And again, the IPP was not a panacea. It was not perfect, but it did a huge amount of good for U.S. leadership, for the economy, for environmental goals. And that's the kind of bold leadership we need. We actually need to go further. That was just a starting point, but it's a good example of how regulation follows policy, not the other way around.
Excellent. There are few with your background, your experience, your education, both in the military and the civilian worlds, as well as your work at the Justice Department. So you have a great perspective on the things that we just talked about. What would you share with our entrepreneurial audience about building a business in the drone industry that they wouldn't necessarily hear from others?
It's important to remember, as the two of you know, that the industry and the associated technologies are very young. I think that's good for investors. It's good for entrepreneurs. The assumptions that guided the industry in the past, however, just don't work in the present or the future. Let me explain. There were settled assumptions of the past with respect to drones, for instance. Drones were tools that required expert pilots to operate. And if that's the case, then commodity hardware is fine. Cameras are king. And autonomy is not terribly useful. You don't really need it if you have expert pilots doing expert level jobs taking a long time. Now there are new rules that are governing a new future. And in this new paradigm, autonomy is king. Drones do not require expert pilots. In fact, AI technology democratizes drones and make every pilot an expert pilot. We're seeing that now with small drones. We'll see it in the future with much larger vehicles capable of carrying passengers and cargo. In this new paradigm with these new rules, that means commodity hardware products really don't work because they don't scale. They don't allow for high levels of autonomy. You need that tight integration between software and hardware. That's critical, I would say, if you're going to start a business in the space, if you're going to invest, if you're playing in the space today. If you don't have tight integration between hardware and software, something's probably wrong. And as a case in point, I mean, Skydio is a young company that's finding success based on those new rules. We are a software company at heart. We make hardware to accentuate the software, not the other way around. A lot like Tesla, a lot like Apple. Our founding story really started at MIT, where our founders met as graduate students in computer science and AI. And the founding premise of the company accords with those new rules that I mentioned. It's that drones have incredible potential, but in order to achieve that potential, you must be able to trust the drone to fly itself. The way to make drones more useful, you might say, is to make them more intelligent. And we use computer vision and deep neural networks to do exactly that. So it's important to keep in mind there were these assumptions in the past, but there are new rules for a future that people in this space should be aware of.
Brendan, the U.S. drone industry has faced strong headwinds from incumbent manufacturers based in China. Some of them have been associated with security risks. Is the past prologue, or to the contrary, are we witnessing the dawn of a rebirth and resurgence of the domestic drone industry?
Well, I think the death of the U.S. drone industry has been greatly exaggerated. For years, people have assumed that the U.S. has lost this market. The white flag has been raised, that territory has been ceded to companies based in the People's Republic of China, which to date control roughly 80 to 90% of the U.S. in global domestic marketplace. I don't think that the past is prologue. I think those new rules that we just discussed are creating new market realities that will change the game. Let me give you an example. In November of 2007, Forbes magazine released a cover story with a cover photo of the CEO of Nokia holding a Nokia phone, a flip phone, to his ear. The title headline read, "Nokia 1 billion customers, can anyone catch the phone king?" Well, in June of that year, just a few months earlier, Apple had released a small device called the iPhone. And as we all know now, within 3 years' time, the iPhone would crush Nokia and BlackBerry and the traditional legacy phone manufacturers that made cheap commodity hardware in a move that few observers saw coming. And we're actually seeing similar trends play out right now in the drone space. It's the shift from hardware-centric devices that are hard to fly and easy to crash to software-driven devices that are elegant and capable and easy to use. And that's why American AI technology is reshaping the skies and in turn, reshaping the marketplace. So look, America is back better than ever. And I think in the long term, poised to prevail.
And the AI and the software will be a key part of your differentiating factor versus your Chinese competitors.
Exactly right. Software matters a great deal. Software is the game. You have to have tight integration, but if your software story is lagging, you're not going to be able to play ball under those new rules that we discussed. And that's why I think that the US will lead the way. Again, I wouldn't say that our leadership is guaranteed. It's possible if we fail to have the kind of policy leadership that put a person on the moon in the AAM and UAS space, then we could fall behind. But I think that's unlikely because of US leadership in AI in particular.
But you can argue that there's very advanced software and arguably even better AI abroad for a whole bunch of reasons. So do you think that without the government intervention here, the small UAS market in the US would not be facing such a prosperous future?
I don't necessarily think that's true. A couple of things. I mean, one, there is a bipartisan consensus in Washington that the US needs to do more faster and better to maintain leadership in AI. There was just, as you know, a National Security Commission on AI led by Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. It was bipartisan in nature, completed a study over the course of several years that's been exceedingly well received on Capitol Hill. And that study basically concluded that we are ahead, will likely be ahead for the foreseeable future, but there's a lot more that we need to do as a society to stay ahead. There's no doubt that the government has a critical role to play. Remember, policy leadership is everything. You can have the right technology, but without the right policies, your technology has no fertile soil in which to grow. That's certainly what we need. We have technology. We just need that policy soil to help us sprout roots and ultimately bloom.
And before going to autonomy, let's talk about the Blue Drone program a little bit, which must have provided a pretty strong tailwind to Skydio's business on the DoD side. Can you provide a quick overview of the program?
Sure. So the genesis of the story started maybe a decade ago when US soldiers would go to Best Buy before deployment and buy small, cheaply made quadcopters in the hope of gaining a tactical advantage in the battlefield. And those were useful, but they were very cheaply made, and they also presented a serious national security threat, given that they were bound to comply with national security directives from the Chinese government. So the military had a decision to make. They knew that they needed tactical situational awareness in the battlefield. The traditional way the military handles that problem is to ask tier one defense contractors like Lockheed Martin to say, make a quadcopter for the US Army. They did not do that because they know what they would get. They would get a drone that's $1 million, extremely cumbersome to use, requires a full-time pilot, impossible to fix in the field, and that ultimately doesn't scale. They would get a $10,000 toilet in the form of a drone. So the military, to their enduring credit, did not do that. They launched a competition to find the absolute best small drone for the military, and they expressly invited non-defense companies to participate. And I think this is an enormous credit to the military because they realized that dual-use companies in AI robotics were years ahead of traditional defense contractors when it came to these devices. The same thing was true with phones. So every Army infantry soldier has essentially a phone that enables them to get real-time battlefield intelligence. They didn't ask Northrop Grumman to build a smartphone. They just bought a ton of phones from Samsung running Google Android software. Dual-use technology is the way you win the technology competition with authoritarian governments. And that's exactly what the government has done here. So essentially, it started out with 30 companies, then it was down to 5. Those 5 became Blue UAS companies, essentially trusted vendors to the Department of Defense. And now the Army has selected Skydio, I'm happy to say, for final integration into that program called the Short Range Reconnaissance Program. And only last month, DIU selected 11 new companies as part of the Blue UAS family. Skydio is the only company to make both lists of Blue UAS drones.
Yeah, and talking to some sophisticated drone users in the US civil government, I picked up quite a bit of frustration regarding these blue drones, specifically that cost increased significantly as a result of it, and at the same time, mission flexibility and utility decreased somewhat because of a limited set of integrated and compatible payloads. How do you respond to these claims?
Yeah, well, I can address Skydio drones in a couple of points. One, Skydio drones are completely cost competitive with DJI drones. In fact, right now we're selling the Skydio 2 starter kit for $949. Think about that. That's essentially a robot that flies, can automate your workflows for less than $1,000. And given that drone has autonomy features that are simply unmatched by Chinese options, there's not really even a close comparison. DJI recently released a new drone, the Mavic 3. There's a great video just out today on YouTube of an important drone user and expert who, despite being an expert, flew his brand new Mavic 3, which claims to have some level of obstacle avoidance, into a tree, had to hire a 75-foot long bucket truck to retrieve it. If you like retrieving your Chinese drones from trees, you should definitely continue to buy DJI. If you like to have drones that don't crash, that automate your workflow, then you're gonna want to buy a US drone.
So with now the list expanding of these blue drones, and I'm sure it will continue that way, what becomes the differentiating factor? You mentioned the tight integration between hardware and software. That's probably one. What other things? And if you are tightly integrated, how does that work with the DoD's open mission systems and common architecture?
The beauty of a software first device is it makes integration simple and seamless. It's different if you have a hardware first device where software is an afterthought. For us, we start with software and build hardware around it. If you reverse that paradigm, it makes integrations typically much more challenging. So that's one of the strong benefits from an AI company that's software first, certainly like Skydio. The other benefit is data security. Companies like ours take cybersecurity very seriously. That's one reason why we're able to serve federal agencies. And we're fortunate to have incredible relationships, including sales relationships across the entire federal government, across the critical infrastructure space with companies that care deeply about cybersecurity, just like us. Contrast that with traditional legacy drones subject to PRC national security directives anywhere in the world. There's really not a fair comparison there. People who care about data security buy US drones. Not only do they work better, they automate your workflows, they don't fly into trees, but they protect your data.
Let's talk about automation and autonomy, often mentioned as force multipliers for the capabilities of Skydio's drones. Why is that?
Well, autonomy does change the game. Autonomy enables businesses and operators to integrate drones into everyday jobs. That's the difference, right? In the past, drones were flown by expert pilots in a drone team that came on site for a particular purpose for a very short time. Well, that's a great way to make sure that drones never scale, that drones never achieve their full potential to keep workers safe, to benefit the economy and the environment. Let me give you an example. In the bridge inspection context, we work with North Carolina Department of Transportation, actually many other states, both in the US and governments and agencies abroad, to inspect drones completely autonomously. In the past, bridge inspectors use tools called snooper trucks, which are giant semi-trucks with huge bucket trucks. And to use them, you have to shut down the bridge, usually in both lanes of traffic, for hours, usually 6 to 12 for every single inspection. And now with a $1,000 autonomous device, that bridge inspector can go to the drone with a couple of people, maybe a couple of drones, not shut the bridge deck down at all, and inspect the underside of the bridge all the way down to the ground and go places that they couldn't get even with a bucket truck. And they don't need expert pilots. You just need your bridge inspector who is an expert on bridges. The problem with using so-called expert pilots is that one, they actually don't know what they're looking at. So they're usually not a bridge inspector. Same thing is true with the electric industry. People who climb towers for a living know what to look for on a tower. Expert pilots might not. That's why it makes more sense, to make those tower climbers pilots as well. And you do that by producing a drone that turns everybody into an expert pilot. That's the way that the industry scales. And that's also the example of why autonomy matters so much in growing the industry.
Brendan, what's the FAA perspective on autonomy?
So the FAA sees autonomy coming. And I'll share a secret with you. Regulators actually like aircraft that are hard to crash. Those are their favorite kind of aircraft. And that's why regulators tend to appreciate autonomous solutions more than you might think. When it comes to drones, for instance, the obstacle avoidance that you get with an autonomous aircraft is a gift because it gives a regulator more assurance that operations, especially operations really low to the ground, can be conducted safely. So I think it's a misnomer to think, as many have in the industry, that regulators will balk at autonomous aircraft. Regulators actually want autonomous aircraft because they do want to reduce the risk of crashes. They want to reduce the risk of injury. It's still important, of course, for autonomous solutions to prove that they meet baseline levels of safety. I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't, quite the opposite. But it is certainly a misnomer to assume, as some do, that the FAA and other regulators view autonomy as anathema. That's just not the case.
And do you focus right now or have this expectation that most of the flight operations will be in the very low levels, below 400 feet AGL? And if that's the case, then probably, yes, the FAA has a lot less scrutiny on the autonomy technology on board. But if you go towards the FAA and say, we'll fly this very autonomous or increasingly autonomous systems in controlled airspace, then I'm sure they will have a much different perspective on the neural networks that are running on the drones.
I think there's actually a great deal of symmetry from the perspective of the regulator. I think the FAA, and we're lucky that this is the case, they're inclined to take a performance-based approach to autonomy. They know that they will never be able to hire a room full of software engineers capable of understanding and reverse engineering deep neural networks from drone companies or AAM companies. That's not going to happen. What they can do is evaluate the level of safety those systems offer in the field. That is what the FAA is very good at, and that is what companies are very good at. And that's really what matters most. So I actually think that the FAA will take fundamentally the same approach to both types of operations, whether it's autonomous operations at low altitude or ultimately autonomous operations at much higher altitudes. The difference is in timing. Right now, the way to achieve autonomy is to do what we like to call unlocking the airspace from the ground up. It's enabling low altitude, high value, low risk operations and working your way up from there. That's how regulators see it. That's how we see it at Skydio. And I think that's why we've been successful in working with regulators to do exactly that.
Tell us about some of the advancements in industry FAA collaboration. What's the biggest advancement in the recent years?
I would point to a couple of examples. One, just last month, the FAA reimagined something called the Drone Advisory Committee. This has been a public-private partnership that serves as the principal outside advisor, if you will, to the Secretary of Transportation and the administrator of the FAA on drone policy in the United States. They recently reimagined that Drone Advisory Committee as the Advanced Aviation Advisory Committee to integrate the AAM perspective. I think that's important, hopefully helpful going forward to fuse UAS into the AAM universe and vice versa. The second is that the FAA very recently, they launched a committee to develop the rules that will govern the future of operations beyond line of sight. That, of course, is the holy grail. That's the whole point of the industry, is to operate beyond the operator's line of sight to do useful tasks. And that committee, I think, reflects the fact, contrary to the views of some, that the FAA is actually more forward-leaning than you might think. Skydio is really happy to lead one of the working groups on that rulemaking committee, which is due to offer recommendations to the FAA fairly soon. It's a very, very, very broad committee involving the civil liberties community, traditional airlines, drone companies, individual operators, you name it, they're on it. It's a great example of policy leading regulations, not the other way around.
So, Brendan, as the former Associate Deputy Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice, where you led the DOJ's drone program and served on the FAA committee that oversaw the integration of drones into the national airspace system, what's been accomplished with integration in the last few years? So
the FAA has approved a lot more one-off waivers than they ever did in the past. And as I mentioned, they've also begun this new rulemaking committee, which, knock on wood, should be really helpful for U.S. leadership in aviation. The overall trend line is really positive, but there's simply no doubt that there's a lot more work ahead that needs to be done.
And what near and long-term challenges remain?
I think if you step back, we have a problem in this country that you might call the missing middle. If you look at our regulatory system, it is, like Charles Dickens, it's a tale of two cities. We have, with respect to drones, a rule that allows very limited operations called Part 107 on the low ebb. And on the high end, we have type certification. And we have literally nothing in between. That missing middle is the way that we win in this global competition. It's the way that this industry grows to match the imaginations and the expectations of both the public and investors and folks in business now. And I think what's even more interesting is that Europe arguably beat us to the punch. And when that happens, it's often the case, although not always, that something has gone wrong here in the US. Europe has a low-end system. It's called the open category, which allows commercial operations. They have a high-end system, basically certification, but they have something in the middle. They have streamlined approvals for advanced operations without requiring the full-bore type certification system for really small AI-enabled devices that weigh, 2 to 10 pounds. So it is ironic that our European colleagues have arguably done a better job of framing a regulatory system than we have. So how do we fill this missing middle? I would just offer two thoughts. It's something that we call at Skydio the UP principles, and the U in UP stands for unlocking the airspace from the ground up. Thinking about airspace just like regulators do, enabling routine beyond line of sight operations close to structures in the ground, scaling up. From there, the P in UP stands for promoting pathways to autonomy. Let's create scalable pathways to enable autonomous operations in stages with increasing levels of automation and evolving roles for remote pilots in command. We know that autonomy enables safety, efficiency, and scalability, and we have entered this new age of autonomy. We need policy to beat that drum one last time that gets us there, and the UP principles are a way that we can fill that missing middle, catch up to near-peer competitors, and ultimately win the future.
I would extend this notion of the tale of two cities even to how the FAA looks at the airspace. So I see that as, one side of this equation being the very low level below 400 feet, where most things are best effort based. You don't really need to prove and certify systems to the extent that you otherwise would in manned aviation because of the use cases that you're flying around. Yeah, right. You're taking the drone to go take a picture of the roof, for example, or inspect a cell tower. And here the robustness and reliability matter less. Then if you're in the second side of the equation is the controlled airspaces, the traditional manned aviation where procedures, equipage rules, certification apply just as if you were operating as a traditional aircraft. And I also see that this space in the middle is evolving and needs to evolve, but in a way that there will be increasingly mimicking the traditional robust requirements, because you will increase the complexity of the use cases. Your overall air and ground risk combination might increase, right? If you fly over congested urban areas, for instance. How do you view this evolution in terms of certification and requiring a certain level of robustness in avionics and services supporting these operations?
Luca, it's a great point. In general, the regulatory system needs to revolve around levels of risk. That seems obvious, but it's an important point to make because it doesn't always work that way. So in a right thinking system, the system in the US is not bad. Again, I think the FAA deserves a lot more credit than they commonly receive, and I want to underscore that point. But on the low end, that low end system should allow low risk operations. In the missing middle today, you should allow at least medium, maybe some types of high risk operations that, do you really need to type certify a 2-pound drone that flies at 50 feet above a structure on closed industrial sites? I can tell you regulatory agencies don't want to do that. Some companies are interested in it, but is that really good for business? Is that really what we want to do? But on the high end, like you said, there's absolutely a place for certification. There are a lot of room for improvements there too. And a good example in the crewed context is the Honda Jet. I mean, it took 15 years, arguably, for the United States to certify the first Honda Jet. The Honda Jet is a jet. It looks like every other business jet. It has some differences in the fuselage, the propulsion systems, but not massive step changes. For our colleagues that make larger drones and AAM vehicles, you better hope that the FAA does not take as long to certify you as it took them to certify the barely different Honda Jet. That's our certification system. So again, I agree that there's a role for certification, but that process has some flaws that unless changed, represent a potentially serious threat to the ability of this new technology to prove value in the field.
And are Skydio drones in the FAA's certification pipeline?
So I'm not going to talk about that, but I will say that we strongly think that this missing middle needs to be filled. And I'll give you an example. We've been fortunate to have more advanced operations approved with the U.S. than any other drone manufacturer. And the latest example of that was our work with BNSF Railway, the largest Category 1 railroad in the United States. In June of this year, the FAA approved what is the most advanced operational approval for drones in the US or anywhere in the world for civil drones. And that is a waiver that allows BNSF to use Skydio drones and Skydio docks across a very substantial portion of its national railway network, completely beyond line of sight, flown completely remotely from hundreds and thousands of miles away without any people on site. There's nothing else like it in the US or around the world. And again, it shows you that waiver, by the way, does not rely on certification. It shouldn't. That's the missing middle. It's an example of a one-off waiver that is putting a Band-Aid on the lack of a sustainable, scalable regulatory regime in the United States.
So how does one work around certification?
So again, I think this is one of the misnomers in the field, is that certification is the sword and the stone issue. Certification makes sense for some aircraft in certain types of high-risk operations. It certainly doesn't make sense for all types of aircraft and all types of operations. At the end of the day, regulators let you do that which you can safely do. It's really that easy. So if you can prove that you can conduct a given operation safely, regulators will let you do it. And the FAA is no different. They get a lot of flack from the industry, and there's a lot more we need to do as a country, but the FAA will let you do that which you can safely do. And we've certainly proven that to be true with our waiver with BNSF and many other waivers that allow true beyond line of sight, even remote operations that would have been science fiction even a year or two ago.
Brendan, what have you learned from your customers about what really matters to them? What are their pain points and what types of use cases are customers looking to apply autonomous solutions?
I've been at Skydio for a couple of years, and in that time, I've developed something that I've taken to call the axiom of automation, and I'll be interested to get your take on this. From what I can see working with customers here and overseas is that robots like ours have the widest adoption in areas where traditional methods are dangerous, expensive, or inefficient. To give you an example of areas that are most ripe for automation, it's industrial inspection. Traditional methods are expensive, they take forever, they require experts, and by the way, they pollute the planet at the same time. Less ripe for automation, and this may be a point of controversy, is last mile package delivery. It's critically important. There's a role for drones in package delivery. We will see that take shape, but it's just going to take longer to play out because traditional methods aren't terrible. And in fact, with the advent of last mile electric vehicles, the business case becomes even more challenging for our friends in the package delivery space with drones. So that axiom certainly proves true with respect to our customers, and not only to our customers, but the entire marketplace, right? The market today for people who pay to use drones in the enterprise setting is dominated by infrastructure inspection and advanced photography. That is 95% plus of the market. So that axiom, again, I think that's proving true now, and I think that's going to continue to prove true, I would argue, into the future.
That's 95% of the overall market?
That's my rough count, Jim. You may want to check my homework on that. But
yeah.
I think by being in the market, in and around the market as I have for quite some time, I think it's just a simple fact, right? If you look at package delivery, it's a national share, certainly less than 1% of the US market. Everything else is pretty much advanced photography or inspection.
And it plays well to autonomous solutions.
It certainly does. Exactly. Right. So infrastructure inspectors are advancing autonomous solutions by necessity. We're in a supply chain shortage. We're in a labor shortage. So that automation and AI, a necessity when it used to be nice to have. So now people have to automate workflows they didn't have to automate 3 years ago. That is advancing AI solutions across the board, not just in the air. But we're certainly seeing that at Skydio, and I think that will be good for the industry as a whole.
You mentioned BNSF and the important milestone that you've reached with the FAA on remote operations, which I think is incredible. Tell us more about what that means broadly for the industry. And if an operator wants to conduct a similar operation, is there a set of requirements that somebody can pick up and then mimic the operation and receive all the necessary waivers? Are we at that point yet?
It's a great question. The short answer is not necessarily. While the FAA has leaned forward, to their credit, and issued very broad, very advanced, very aggressive approvals like the one for BNSF and Skydio, it's much harder in this missing middle universe to scale those operations. So things are still pretty much one-off. Another example would be last year, we worked with North Carolina Department of Transportation to secure with the FAA the nation's first true beyond line of sight waiver. And this is a waiver that allows North Carolina DOT to inspect thousands of drones across the state beyond the operator's line of sight without any of the traditional impediments that waivers require, like the use of expensive radars or the use of visual observers. So a bridge inspector shows up to a bridge, gets out of her truck, pulls a Skydio drone out of her backpack, flies it beyond her line of sight, does the whole job, inspects the bridge, never has to shut it down, and then does another one, or maybe another one after that in the same day. That's what the waiver does. There are 13,500 bridges in the state of North Carolina, just to give you a sense of scale from the mountains to the ocean. And this has allowed North Carolina DOT to really advance the ball in a meaningful way while protecting workers who do very, very dangerous work. So that, though, if you wanted to do that, there's a way to scale that. But the reality is you're going to have to use an AI-enabled drone to do that, because a dumb drone that uses GPS, bottom line, is going to fall out of the sky if you fly beneath a bridge deck. You need a drone that's able to see and understand the world around it and fly in close proximity to infrastructure without crashing. That's why autonomy is so important.
And what else stands in the way of broader market adoption?
The main thing that stands in the way of broader market adoption is that people are still using dumb drones. Drones need to move from tools to teammates, devices that work for us rather than the other way around. And of course, policy leadership is the other potential impediment that is standing in the way of adoption. I mean, that is what we need, that kind of moonshot leadership to take this industry and I think our society to new heights.
So, Brendan, Skydio has talked about flying cameras being of greater value. And why are Skydio's drones, or drones overall, a transformational tool, as your CEO has talked about?
Let me give you another example outside of the bridge inspection context, and that's electric utilities. Right now, inspecting towers, transmission towers, is extremely difficult. In fact, often, but not always, towers are only inspected on a 10 to 12 year basis, which is absolutely remarkable if you think about it. It's not because it wouldn't be better to inspect them more frequently. It's because it's incredibly difficult and expensive to inspect them, and dangerous. 40 tower inspectors die every single year just doing their job. And these are experts. So contrast that with, say, using a small Skydio autonomous flying robot to inspect transmission towers. So just the other day, I was out with a large US utility, and a 20-year veteran lineman picked up a Skydio drone, never flown a drone before, flew it inside the middle of a 150-foot tall transmission tower with his jaws on the ground. This is the job he's done his whole life, but with a drone, within 5 minutes, he was able to inspect the tower completely. It would have taken him 30 to 45 minutes hand climbing the tower. And even then, it would have been extremely difficult for him to take pictures of stuff that needed to be fixed. But with a drone, he could do that in a few minutes. In that context, the fewer climbs that line workers have to do, the longer their careers, because this is incredibly taxing. It's like playing professional sports. But small autonomous robots make that easy, make it safe, make it scalable, make it efficient, and make it really, really, really valuable. You can't do that with a dumb drone. You can't fly inside of a high voltage transmission tower with a dumb drone with the magnetometer. It's going to fall out of the sky. With an autonomous device, it's easy as could be.
We had an interesting conversation with another speaker recently, and we touched on a little bit on what you're describing, but it was in the context of pipeline inspections. And he argued that, yes, even though you can do a lot more with drones, the ultimate customer, the owner of these towers, might not necessarily want to use them more frequently just because they can, right? They're going to see what they are required to do in terms of frequency of inspection from a regulatory perspective. So I think that'll be an interesting dynamic to observe, to see how the inspection schedules change in response to having this technology available more readily and providing a lot more value. Or will people just say, you know what, I'll just go down the path of least resistance. I'm required to inspect it every 10 years. It's worked well for now, and I'll continue down that road rather than investing in cost and training and people and maintenance or other service providers in these new technologies for marginal benefit, quote.
A couple of thoughts on that. It's a really interesting and important point. There are a couple of variables here. One is most pipelines and transmission towers today are also inspected by helicopters. If you look at the utility environment, roughly 10% of workplace fatalities for some of these inspection operations are caused by helicopter crash. So Southern Energy, one of the largest utilities in the country, started their drone program several years ago after 2 of their employees tragically perished in a helicopter while inspecting long linear lines. We've seen that story play out across the globe. So I do think that the risk associated with traditional methods of inspection is driving a huge shift to autonomy-enabled, small, smart flying robots. The other thing I would say is that while an infrastructure owner might be inclined to keep the traditional frequency of inspection as it is, the regulator may disagree. The regulator may say the standard best case practice now is creating a digital twin of your infrastructure, if you're, let's say, PG&E, to avoid sparking wildfires in the future. Now, in the past, and I'll keep this short, you couldn't easily produce a digital twin of a transmission tower or a semiconductor plant or something like that. Now you can. At Skydio, we have a product called 3D Scan that basically allows you to push button on any asset, and the drone will create a beautiful 3D model on the edge without you doing anything other than providing safety oversight. The drone does all the flying, it builds its own model itself. So if you have technology that allows levels of safety that can be achieved with digital twins, let's say, regulators, insurance companies, the public, political leaders will know that. And I think there'll be this really interesting push to try and use these best of breed practices in ways that can save lots of money if you find problems sooner. I would disagree, I suppose, with that other perspective. I think that you're going to see these things sort of take off in the next several years here.
Yeah, that's a great point. And plus, there's so many things that we will learn once we start using this new technology in terms of things that are not necessarily visible today, but will become increasingly so once we start exploring and experimenting and integrating them increasingly into enterprise workflows. So why are entrepreneurs attracted to advanced air mobility?
Human flight has always fascinated the mind and captured the wallet, you might say. So I don't think it's any surprise that investments have followed imaginations into the AAM industry. You see that most prominently in the flying taxi space. Extremely important, extremely valuable, just going to take longer to realize than maybe some might think. But I think that's good. We need a big tent approach in this industry. We do need people's fascinations to fuel new levels of growth, new types of technology, from propulsion systems to the overall ecosystem, the infrastructure that enables it. So I'm quite happy that people grew up watching the Jetsons and are now using that spark to make this new era of flight possible.
And if you fast forward 5 years and 10 years, what does the industry look like?
I think you'll see small, smart devices that can perform useful tasks on command. At Skydio, we think that within 5 to 10 to 15 years, drones will really be more like infrastructure than aircraft. Drones will be teammates that you call upon to do stuff when you want to do it. So if you have electric substations to inspect, if you are filming yourself flying down a double black diamond ski slope, push button, get drone, that world's coming. And in that world, drones aren't really aircraft. They're just tools. Things that fly and do stuff probably aren't even regulated like aircraft. So we're going to get to that future. It'll take a while, but it's pretty exciting.
So Brendan, on a similar note, what outcomes will most be improved as a result of the use of drones?
I think the first outcome that we get excited about at Skydio is safety. And not just safety of aircraft in the air and people on the ground, but people who do dangerous jobs for a living. We talked about people who climb towers. It's one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. People who inspect bridges, an exceedingly difficult, dangerous job. Small robotic devices, both in the air and on the ground, really make a world of difference for people doing dangerous jobs. That same person now can do her job much more easily, much more effectively than before. And the second benefit, I think that certainly we care a lot about, and that policymakers care a lot about, is the environment. You're going to have vastly lower levels of carbon emissions associated with new forms of electric propulsion systems, even the small electric motors that we use on Skydio drones, the much larger eVTOL aircraft of tomorrow. And we've done some analysis and studies in-house. Just using small electric drones to inspect a single bridge is equivalent to removing roughly 5 vehicles from the road in terms of carbon emission. That's something that people can get behind. That's just another reason why you're going to see a lot of growth in this industry over the next 5 years.
In your opinion, what's the most common misconception or misunderstanding on the topic of small drones?
I think the largest one is that it's all about the data. That's a tagline you hear. It's become cliche. People believe it. I think it's wrong, because how you gather the data determines the data you get. So it is a mistake to think that it's all about the data. It's all about the package. It's all about high levels of software and hardware integration. That's how you get better data more easily. So it's not all about the data. It's certainly more than that.
What's the most beneficial use of data that would come from drones? And why do people always say it's all about the data?
I think people say it's all about the data because that's the traditional paradigm for those old rules, those assumptions of the past that we talked about earlier, where you have commodity hardware products, the camera is king. But in this new world where autonomy is king, and you need specialized hardware products with integrated software, then you're getting new types of data altogether. The best example, the most valuable example, is digital twins. Long been the holy grail of industrial inspection, long been impossibly hard. One example, there's a large US semiconductor plant in the Western United States. This company, large brand name company, you would all know it if I said it, used to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars over a period of several weeks on occasion to create a digital twin of a certain part of the plant. It literally took weeks. It took tons of people to capture the data by building scaffolding and taking thousands of pictures by hand. And then it took weeks to build a digital twin on the backside. After doing that, because this is a multi-billion-dollar company that could afford it, then they could track changes in damage over time. Well, compare and contrast that with the process they use now. They use Skydio 3D scan running on a $1,000 Skydio drone, and they were able to create a digital twin in 22 minutes of autonomous flying. They literally turned the drone on, told it to scan this part of the plant. It did it. It shot out the model on the back end. They threw that into a processor, and the same day, they get the digital twin, and it took them weeks and months and hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce in the past. And now, what does that mean? It means they can run a digital twin every day, every week, and track even minute changes in the infrastructure that allow them to fix problems before they're problems. That is enormously valuable for infrastructure, and that's really why you need smart drones that do that for you.
But doesn't that also imply that it is about data? It's just a matter of making sure that the data that you're getting is actionable and relevant and useful.
I don't think so, because you can't get that level of data with a dumb device. People do use dumb drones to create digital twins, but it takes an expert pilot days or weeks to take exacting photos of the infrastructure, and then usually a week to a month on the back end to build painstakingly a digital model based on those hand-taken pictures. So I think that the data is part of this mosaic. You need software that makes it easier to do that, because the traditional method does not scale. That's why you don't see it. Everyone has always known digital twins would be important. They were just too expensive to create until AI technology that is a fusion of both hardware and software made it possible.
Brendan, more so than in most industries, there's a lot of discussion around responsible business use and ethics.
But when it comes to artificial intelligence, I think ethics matter. And I would encourage people, when you're looking to invest in an AI robotics company, when you're looking to join a company, ask how that company approaches ethics and ask them to show you, not tell you. See if they have any ethical principles on the development and deployment of this technology. That's important. One reason it's this: there are really two visions of AI in this world. There's one that enables liberty, and there's another that denies it. We talked about the National Security Commission on AI earlier this year. That report has a fantastic line. They said that the AI competition between democratic governments and authoritarian governments is a values competition. We want to be on the side of AI that promotes liberty. And as a result, we're the only drone company right now to have a set of ethical and policy principles governing our work that forces us to think about the holistic impact that our products have, not just on communities, but on countries. We don't weaponize our products. We think deeply about engaging with public sector customers. We don't sell to repressive regimes. We want AI to reflect our values. And I think that's an increasing and sort of little understood, but very, very important part of this story of new technology entrants that rely on AI. We need those companies to take things seriously. What if Facebook in 2008 had issued a set of really aggressive ethical guidelines and followed them to a T? Would we see the kinds of issues we're seeing now? And how much different and better would the world be if companies use that kind of leadership to build technology in a responsible way?
So, Brendan, as you prepared for our podcast, what's the one point you'd most want our audience to take from your comments?
It's simply that small drones are a big deal. Simple as that, Jim.
Okay. That's a great summary. So I'll also ask, is there anything we haven't asked that you'd like to talk about?
I guess just to close, I do think it's important for the industry to work together in a way that we haven't necessarily done in the past, and to work across the industry, across both the small drone manufacturers, the eVTOL community, and with our public partners to ensure that the U.S. leads this revolution. We have more to do to ensure that we maintain our leadership position, because look, if we don't, others will, and we may not like the results. I think it's awesome what y'all are doing. And I love the first one. I thought it was terrific. And a lot of your comments were unexpected, not the normal fare that you hear in this world.
That's great. Thanks again, Brendan. Great having you with us. And I'm sure our listeners will enjoy listening to your perspective. Thanks again.
Likewise. Thanks all.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.